Great. Thanks very much, Beatrice. So we're all excited to be here to share some of our recent work. And we've called today's session Comprehension in EMI, Some Evidence from and Implications for Lectures. This data comes from our project that's titled Real-Time Monitoring of Dynamic English Listening in Lectures, and it's funded by the Swedish Research Council. And we'll hear from both Maria and Aki in a bit. Like I said, our project focuses on lecture comprehension, and I'd like to use Zoom polls to get some input from the audience that's here. So I'm going to launch a poll and ask, what percentage of an EMI lecture would you say the average SEFRA B2 student understands? And of course, this depends on the discipline, it depends on the context, on lots of things. But just to give a quick average of what we think, thanks for those. We've got about 80%, 85% respondents. Great. I'm going to end the poll and share the results here. So you can see most of us have said it's something like between 40 and 80%. And that makes us on our team wonder, okay, what's going on with that percentage that's not understood? Students are understanding some things, but what aren't they understanding? That's one of the goals of our project, to try to find out what's happening in that percent where we don't know about student comprehension. A few notes about our participants. They're all university students in a variety of majors. Most of them are from Sweden, but we have collected data from Germany, the Seychelles as well. And then there's a question mark because we're always looking for new places to collect data from. So if you're interested, please let us know. We also work with university lecturers in these different subjects. We record their lectures and work with some of their students. Beatrice mentions that we use a new method for understanding the lecture experience, and that new method revolves around a footpedal device that listeners use to report understanding and non-understanding. And there's a picture of this footpedal that we ask students to press when they are not able to follow the lecture, when they don't have 100% confident comprehension of what's happening in the lecture. That foot pedal provides a timestamp of when the participant has pushed the pedal. And at the same time, we record the lectures with the video recording. Then we've got the timestamp from the foot pedal and the timestamp from the lecture video, and we can match those up to find out exactly when students are reporting that they have trouble understanding. And these procedures are written up in a few different papers. The data outputs that we get looks like this. You can see in the left-hand column, time on video. There's a second-by-second clock that's counting. And then we see some columns for each of the four students. The column with zeros shows that the student is not pushing the pedal at the time. So we would interpret that as they're following along just fine with no problem. When a student presses the pedal, then we see a 1 here. That means they're pressing the foot pedal, indicating to us that there's some kind of comprehension challenge that they're experiencing. We don't know what it is yet, but we know when they push the pedal. And that helps us identify places in the lecture video to ask the students about. So our data set consists of several different things. But first, these foot pedal timestamps. We also conduct pre-lecture interviews with students and lecturers. We've recorded about 23 hours of lecture time in those various subjects. We've spent about 25 hours interviewing our participants before the lecture. And then we also do post-lecture stimulated recall interviews using the timestamps after the lecture. And that last bullet point is really the main data point, how they explain these instances of non-comprehension. These are some timelines that represent 4 of the lectures that we've worked with, and you can see lots of little dots here. Each participant is represented by a different color, and then we can see when in time they press the pedal. You can see some blanks in the middle of these timelines. Maybe you can guess what those are. That's the break time. What this shows us, though, is that students are pushing the pedal at lots of different times throughout the lecture. And on that note, I'd like to share another poll related to what these reasons might be for why students would push the pedal. So this poll asks, which of the following impact student lecture comprehension the most? And this is your prediction. What do you think? Okay, everybody's answered. Great. Thanks for this wonderful participation. So let's take a look together at these predictions. So every one of the options that we provided had someone say, yeah, this could impact lecture comprehension. We've got background knowledge and teacher speech towards the top. And towards the lower end, the slides themselves. Interesting because Aki's going to be talking about multimodality and slides a bit later. And then things like the environment, motivation, note-taking skills come up towards the end. In the middle, we have teacher engagement and the students' English language skills. Of course, there are going to be a combination of these different elements that will impact lecture comprehension. And those responses and considering those different options leads us to the coding scheme that we use to categorize the responses that students give, their explanations for why they push the pedal at different times. We have 6 main categories in our coding scheme: top-down related issues, bottom-up, affective, multimodal, environmental, and teacher speech related. Under these main categories, rather, we have more specific codes to try to tease out differences between what the students are explaining. And I'd like to just go through these coding schemes a bit to give you some idea of what they mean. For the top-down related issues, these would be based on past experiences with the speaker, with the topic, with the context. So depending on, for instance, background knowledge or lack of background knowledge, that would be a top-down related issue. These issues involve prior and developing knowledge of both the content and the language, and they relate to our instinct to develop hypotheses when we're listening and then check them. We make and evaluate predictions. This is a very big area, so we broke it down into 4 subcategories. In particular, the difference between language-related and content-related issues. Of course, a big challenge in EMI is to try to tease out when is it related to language, when is it related to content. We also have sociocultural and individual cognitive processing as top-down subcategories. Our other categories are bottom-up, and that relates to the oral input, combining phonemes into clusters, into words and utterances. It's related to segmenting the speech stream. The affective category relates to emotional state, attention, concentration, listening anxiety. those kind of things. The multimodal category involves combinations of audio and visual inputs and how the teacher might use the slides. We have an environmental category related to things happening in the classroom, like if a student walks in late, that could interrupt the comprehension of our participants. And then the teacher speech category relates to when a teacher might be mumbling or make sudden mid-sentence changes when they're speaking. And so we have these 6 main categories. I'd like to continue with your participation and ask you to predict then, which category do you think would be the most problematic for students based on your experience, your intuition? And again, this is going to relate to the context that you work in, the student proficiency level, who the teachers are who are teaching. Wonderful. Again, 100% response rates. Thanks very much for your participation here. So based on these predictions, top down has the most issues, and that's quite accurate according to our data. Bottom up bottom up teacher speech come in second. Yeah, and I think that plays out in the data as well, with fewer multimodal and not many in the effective category. That actually aligns quite well with our data, I'd say. So thanks for that input. Related to the coding scheme, we have written this up in Research Methods in Applied Linguistics. If you'd like to read more about the categories, the codes that we have with examples and definitions. But for now, I'll turn it over to Maria, who's going to talk about some top-down and bottom-up challenges.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Joe. So I will continue here more from a kind of discourse analytical perspective. And just to remind you, so the top-down challenges would then concern things like language, content, knowledge of sociocultural aspects and individual cognitive processes, whereas bottom-up challenges refers to, for example, phoneme perception or passing speech. And as we will see in the data, these types of categories are intertwined. So many of our participants are very good educators, excellent educators, and excellent users of English, both teachers and students. So I would say that most of the students in our data have probably more than B2 proficiency and generally very good academic literacy skills. But nevertheless, even in these cases, there are some comprehension challenges. So let's take some examples here. So the first one I'd like to show you is from a lecture in philosophy of science. So here the lecturer has a very dialogic style. She interacts a lot with the audience. And during her lecture, she tries to engage students in a debate. Yeah? She's presenting some key concepts for the topic that she's talking about, and she wants students to vote. Yeah? So as you see here in the excerpt, she's basically talking about different orientations in philosophy, like anti-realism, instrumentalism, etc. And she says that for all these to be a coherent philosophical position, we need to be able to draw a distinction between observables and unobservables. So how do you do that? Does anybody have suggestions? Okay, let's start with some examples, she says. Let's start with this marker, and she shows the marker. Who says observable? Then, okay, most people say observable. Okay, let's say neutrinos. which are fundamental elementary particles. Who says observable? Who says unobservable? Okay, good. So, okay, now we seem to have like the marker versus neutrinos. That seems to be like a starting point, right? So here she also writes on the board, as you can see, the marker versus neutrinos. So this is actually an example of very good pedagogical practice. But from the student's point of view, can we go to the next slide, please, Joe? So from the student's point of view, things are not so clear-cut. So here we have 3 participants altogether that agreed to be part of our study. And 2 of them have pressed the pedal during this episode. One student is Celia. She's French-Canadian, and this is her first semester at a university. The other one is Bruno, who's a student from Germany on exchange, and he is already in his 3rd year of university studies. However, both of them have pressed, but for different reasons. For Celia, it's above all this term neutrinos that she says she's never heard of. The interviewer is asking, do you remember how you answered the question? And then she says, okay, depends, but of course there are limits as to how they should be classed, so probably unobservable. But so even though the lecturer gives a very quick definition of neutrinos when she starts the debate, just the fact that this concept is so new and the student has never heard the word is creating obviously a confusion. And for Bruno, who is more advanced in both in his academic studies, but also in the study of philosophy, because he had done it before, it's not clear at the moment what observable and unobservable means in the context of philosophy. So because he's a more mature student in this case and more aware of disciplinary discourse, he's aware that we can't take it for granted that our kind of everyday common sense understanding of observable and observable may apply in the context of philosophy. Then the next example, please, comes from another excellent lecturer who keeps his students engaged by addressing them a lot directly during the lecture. He uses a lot of you pronouns all throughout his presentations. And in this particular excerpt, as you see, he's trying to recreate a kind of scenario where he imagines that the students are different groups of MEPs, sorry, it's members of European Parliament. So he says, some of you are rapporteurs, you are in charge of a legislative file. And this semester, there's like 3 files running through your committee, and you're in charge of that. Some of you are shadows. You belong to other political groups, and you're shadowing the main rapporteur over that particular case. Some of you are coordinate committees, so you are the party whip, if you like. Some of you might be heads of the committee. Some of you might be presidents or vice presidents of the whole political group. Remember political groups? We'll go back to it in a second. So here he goes through a whole bunch of different roles for MEPs, using the same expression, some of you, which in pragmatics would be like a generalized implicature. And so here the students are supposed to follow what he's talking about and make sense in between of these different descriptions of some of the MEPs. So here we have a reaction from also a student who has advanced proficiency in English already in her 3rd year of a full EMI program. Although she reports very few instances of comprehension, she gets confused here. And it's this, some of you are this, some of you are that. So just this repetition of some of you, although it's meant to engage students in in the lecture content, it seems to have the opposite effect here. To the extent that even a relatively new word like rapporteur is lost in this kind of speech stream, because she says that she wasn't really paying attention to the different groups. She said, I didn't like focus on the words. It was more like the general gist of it, which she finds difficult to reproduce, because it's this reference to some of you are this and some of you are that confused her. So this is example of another top-down problem with kind of confusion with discourse patterns. The L1 of the instructors, in the first case, I see there is a question in the chat. L1 is of the philosophy of science lecturer is from Benelux. I won't say which one for anonymity reasons, but they're very similar. The philosophy of science lecturer is from South Europe. Both lecturers have a very good experience of working and studying in the Anglophone countries, one in the US and the other one in the UK. Yeah, so this is basically relatively kind of luxury problems, let's put them. Now, what happens with when students may not have such good language proficiency? So here we have an example from a lecture in marketing research, also part of a full EMI program, a third-year course, where the students are already preparing to write their final research project. Here the lecturer is talking about what's going on in the marketing research, and talking about different kinds of value, here functional and symbolic value. And she talks about Coca-Cola as one of the examples when she explains these two terms. And then as she introduces these two terms, she suddenly has a kind of side thought to engage the audience again. So she thinks, she talks about these two different kinds of value, and then she says, I guess we don't. And then she turns to Joe and said, well, I guess Joe would know where Coca-Cola originates from. It's Atlanta, right? Yes. Then she turns back to class and asks, and did you? You just drink it. It's not produced in Atlanta. Thankfully, it's produced in Carlsberg, I think, in Sweden. She pronounces Carlsberg with an English kind of pronunciation. Okay, so the students, of course, most of them nod one way or another, but this is a very heterogeneous class. Yeah, one of the participants is Chen, whose first language is Mandarin. He scored relatively high on IELTS, as you can see here. He's in his final year of this EMI program, and he had to repeat one of the years because when he first came to Sweden, he wasn't. It wasn't only the language proficiency, but he wasn't used to the way that the students were expected to do a lot of self-study and participate like in critical debates and things of this type. So he didn't seem to have so many issues when we interviewed him. He understood everything, practically everything we said. So his proficiency was quite functional in this context. In the same time, he reported 76 episodes of non-comprehension during this 90-minute lecture, which were related to 88 issues, according to the taxonomy, because sometimes one episode can have more than one issue. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What the lecturer meant when she said those things that I showed earlier was that Coca-Cola originates from Atlanta, Did you know about this? She asks the students. Probably not. You just drink it. It's not produced in Atlanta. It's produced by Carlsberg in Sweden. Now, based on the very long excerpt from the stimulated recall interview, which I won't show here because it's too much data. Basically, what we can reconstruct is that what Chen heard and found nonsensical, because he also understands that it doesn't make any sense. So something from Atlantis, then it's not quite clear, then just drink it. Drink it is one word. Yeah. And it, whatever it is, something, yeah, is originally produced by a council in Sweden. So here we have a whole bunch of issues, basically, yeah. So he didn't catch what something was. He thought it was Atlantis, yeah. So it's a phoneme perception, not Atlanta, but Atlantis. But he says that he doesn't know what Atlantis means. So it's a mixture of bottom up and top down. So even though it was supposed to be Atlanta, but even if it was Atlantis, he still says, oh, well, I don't really know what it means. Drink it. Another word he's never heard of. So, and then it is kind of anaphoric. It refers to Coca-Cola, but he doesn't understand we're talking about Coca-Cola here. And then a council of Sweden is related to this Carlsberg company, the beverage company. So basically, if you go to the next slide, if we think about what caused the misunderstanding here is basically this interruption by the lecturer, then addressing Joe, who is from the US, as an ultimate expert on the origins of Coca-Cola, to confirm where it comes from. Then turning back to students and asking, did you what? So did you know, yeah, where Coca-Cola comes from? But she doesn't put it that way. So you just drink it. It referring to Coca-Cola, yeah. But then it's not produced in Atlanta. It's produced in Carlsberg, so the Carlsberg is not shown anywhere on the slide. She just pronounces it in a kind of English way because it has a somewhat different pronunciation in Danish and Swedish. But for Chen, this is all completely confusing. So if we think of comprehension as a mental representation of lecture discourse, there is a big mismatch between what the lecturer says and what Chen imagines. So here I have a picture of Atlantis, but because he said he didn't know what Atlantis was, but he must have heard the word somewhere, but he didn't know what it meant. So basically, he's confused by Atlantis, but by this new word, drink it, that he never heard of. And then something is produced by council in Sweden. So here, if we also, it's a mixture, as I said already, of bottom up and top down issues. But it's also a question of the students' familiarity with the kind of Western culture and this marketing discourse as part of this business studies, a discipline very much rooted in global North culture, and his unfamiliarity with the local context of the Nordic countries, where Carlsberg is one of the major beverage companies. So for him, this is not because he hasn't studied properly for his lecture, so to speak, but it's also this background knowledge that causes misunderstanding, and also the discourse patterns using it, for example. He didn't understand what it was referring to, and then that then becomes like a trigger for a whole bunch of issues that are related to the Coca-Cola. So just to sum up then, from my part here, as we see here, the content knowledge is not only related to the discipline, but also to the local EMI context where the education is taking place. And misunderstandings or non-understanding can be caused by lack of disciplinary knowledge, or even previous disciplinary knowledge interfering with comprehension sometimes. Then in terms of language, vocabulary is always a big topic in EMI, and there is a great amount of very good research on that. But here we see that it's not only vocabulary, it's also the pragmatics and the academic discourse patterns that can be an issue. We didn't have any kind of rhetorical questions here, but these can also be confusing to students because if a lecturer asks, so what does it mean for blah, 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 and I don't have an answer, yeah. The students may think that the lecturer is maybe incompetent, but it's just something that science hasn't solved yet, yeah. And then, of course, as Joe will now elaborate with more bottom-up issues, the first language of the students may impact their phoneme perception and passing ability. So what the implications mean is that, of course, we should avoid introducing new concepts in activities that require student engagement, like neutrinos or rapporteur examples. Then avoid the kind of implicatures where you expect students to participate, make it all very kind of straightforward. And then we shouldn't assume contextual knowledge when giving examples. And that happens a lot in our data from marketing and business studies. The lecturers seem to be, they don't all have Swedish as L1. They may not even be from Sweden, but very often they refer to local realities, which especially at the master's level would be very difficult for students to follow because they come from many different backgrounds. So that's all I had for my part. So Aki, now, please.
Thanks, Maria. I'll just jump in, but thanks very much for walking us through those examples. I just wanted to share a few more examples of bottom-up challenges. And these come from computer science, where here we see the teacher talking about eggs and then tries to use making an omelet as an example. I'm thinking I can make an omelet. And one of our participants in this lecture pushed the pedal around omelet and said, yeah, I didn't really understand what the teacher said there for that particular word. And so I asked the student a few times and he repeated ominent, ominent. And okay, I want to know exactly what you have in your mind. So can you write down what you hear, some phonetic representation? And it turned out to be this ominent. So he didn't recognize omelet. There was no image of an omelet on the screen or anything. And so he missed the preceding example of making an omelet and how that was connected to some point the teacher wanted to make. This is a bottom-up phoneme recognition error. In the same lecture, the teacher said this. It turns out there exists an X such that Q is true in this logic-related lecture, and then said, but take my word for it. And the student wasn't able to understand this, take my word for it. We asked what the student heard, and this a different student heard work for, but take my work for it, work for it. Okay, that seems kind of strange. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what the student heard. And so they missed, because of this phoneme perception error, then they missed the fact that the teacher's trying to get the students to believe him in this case. Take my word for it, trust me on this particular point. But the student is left wondering what this work for is, and so is missing the point that the teacher's trying to make. So those are just a few other examples of bottom-up errors in phoneme processing. In terms of some implications, some things to think about, especially related to the omelets Example, it could be helpful to use an image or text to reinforce words or concepts. Maybe having an image on the screen would have helped the students connect the sounds that he did hear to the example the teacher was trying to use. A second implication for the classroom could be to do a transcription task on the first day to gauge how well students are picking up each and every word. That might depend on the context. In Sweden, that might not be necessary, but in other EMI contexts, that could be helpful to give the teacher some tangible evidence of how well students are processing the oral input. And then, like any teacher in any subject, regardless of language of instruction, we should be aware of speech rate, articulation, pausing, especially with second language users and listeners to let them process what they've heard. Here we'll leave the top down and the bottom up and move on to Aki, who's going to talk about multimodal challenges.
Thanks, Joe. So we've been looking at very small things like discourse and bottom-up phonemes, but I want to shift the focus to something very big and obvious in our classroom, which is the PowerPoint slides. In the Swedish context, almost all of our classrooms are equipped with projectors and computers, assuming that the lecturer is going to be using PowerPoint slides. And previous EMI studies have positioned slides as something like a supportive device. Oftentimes, teachers put all their lecture text on the slides, or there would be translanguaging features of the slides. But at the same time, studies have shown that those seem to be not necessarily helping all the time. If you take from a theoretical perspective, the cognitive theory of multilingual learning, Mayer and others argue that slides need to be simple and clear, just concise. This is very good. So there seems to be some clash here between the theory of what is recommended and the classroom practices. And we were interested in, okay, what is it? What kind of issues do students actually have in the classroom regarding the slides? And you mentioned like 5% or 8% of you considered perhaps slides were an issue. There are actually more, and I want to show you what we found. So the data is based on 4 of our studies, the philosophy and political science lectures overlap with Maria just said. Altogether, there are 15 students, and they all had different L1s, educational backgrounds, and the length are slightly different, but all of the teachers use slides. And in total, if you could go to the next slide, there were 335 pedal presses instances, and of these 80, which accounts for almost 24%, were somehow attributed to slide issues. So the students mentioned something about the slides that were connected to their comprehension issues. Yes, the frequency differed depending on the lecture. So if you see philosophy, DC2, it was only 8.6. And with DC4, with political science, it was almost 40%. So there is a huge range, yet in all the lectures, something with the slides were attributed to some comprehension issues. And perhaps this could be attributed to how much images were used, like pictures, graphs, which, as you can see in the slides, those differed as well. But no direct connections could be made, and more studies would be necessary. Because when you look at the reasons that the students attributed to these slides, there's a whole range. If you could look at this slide. So this is about the overall frequency. I analyzed what the students said and using thematic analysis, tried to make categories of what they said. So as you can see, some kind of teacher talk alignment was the most frequent issue. I'll talk about what this means more. And then composition related to text content was the second frequent, and so on. So not necessarily the images per se were the issues. So let's go into the top 4 issues. So the most frequent issue with teacher talk and alignment, I want to raise this example from political science. And as you can see in the slide here, it's very concise. You have clear bulleted points with arrows, very clear. But 3 out of the 4 students pressed simultaneously and mentioned they had some issues. And when you asked, they said, those acronyms, I don't know what they mean. And they said the teacher didn't mention them. And when we listened to the lecture, they were correct. The teacher said Brussels instead of BRX, global market economy, instead of LME, coordinated market, instead of CME, and the teacher didn't mention about IP at all. So even these small things like acronyms and misalignment between what the teacher says seem to be causing issues. One student said then, I didn't have time to take notes. So you also see here that the same slide could cause different issues to the student as well. Let's look at the next example. And this is an example from the linguistics issues. And again, very clear slide, clean with the theory and examples. But then one very experienced student said, I've never seen a theory which is actually presented in a formula like this. So the X or the Y. So we see here, it's not necessarily the slide, but some connection with the student's previous knowledge and what a teacher said and the slide. This combination seems to be causing issues as well. Let's look at another example. This is an example from a marketing class where the teacher was talking about globalization. And here the teacher briefly summarized the historical context of the Silk Road and tried to illustrate that this idea of globalization is not new, and had a picture of this Silk Road. And again, 3 out of the 4 students pressed the pedal, and one student said, I'm not sure where the local was supposed to be within the Silk Road. And another student said, I don't know what the Silk Road is. And someone from Asia, as me, was very shocked to hear this. Why would you not know the Silk Road? But again, in this diverse EMI context, it becomes clear through these interviews that we can't assume the background knowledge that the student brings. And then student 3, even though the teacher did summarize and briefly explain what the text said, I didn't have time to read all the text. So again, you see a slide very clear, yet causing different issues for different students. And then let's look at this last example. This is an example from the political science, and the teacher demonstrated this graph. And from this cognitive theory of multimodal learning theory, this is an exemplar slide where you have a clear title, a graph. It should be no problem. Yet, one of the students said, I didn't get what he was referring to in the graph. The teacher did explain clearly what he was pointing to, yet there seemed to be an issue. And this was towards the end of the lecture, and he had these 4 consecutive slides with graphs presented. And then the student pressed, as you can see, 4 times at the moment and said, I just gave up understanding, and I wanted him to finish. So previous studies on slides tend to focus on individual slides and not how the slides are sequenced and how that may cause cognitive overload and non-understanding as well. So to briefly summarize, what we're seeing here is this different reactions to the same slides. So even though students feel non-understanding or comprehension difficulties, they seem to differ slightly even with the same slides. And this aligns with the complexity theory principles, where learner variability and moment-to-moment changes in the students' adaptation, also the initial conditions that the students bring to the classroom affecting their comprehension. The key challenges connected to slides could be summarized as I discussed: the misalignment of teacher talk and slide content, use of unfamiliar terms, these complex graphs and unfamiliar images. These all align with studies coming from the disciplinary literacy studies. Yet there seemed to be something more, and not just limited to these. And as you saw with like the sequencing, but students often commented on this not having enough time. So slides are temporal, lectures are temporal, they change quite quickly. And so some students said I didn't finish reading, I didn't have time to read all the text. Some students even commented that I couldn't finish understanding. So it wasn't just about reading, but processing. They needed more time. And several students said I didn't have time to take notes. So what we're seeing here is this multimodal in terms of time and note taking as well, causing difficulty, that listening and processing at the same time, reading, multiple semiotic aspects, taking notes, and this is in their second language, and you have to do this before the teacher moves on. And as you also may have noticed from the graphs, those graphs aren't just simple bar graphs. They're complex, they have multiple variables incorporated, and also some of the text information as well. It seems like a lot of the teachers incorporate additional information into their slides, which are not fully explained by the teacher as like additional information. Perhaps us, like experienced academics, are able to process it in a timely fashion, but seems to cause difficulty for the students. And so what can we do as teachers? Perhaps we need to synchronize more of the slides and what we say, explain images, support the understanding of these graphs more, or complex formulas. And perhaps we need to use some text animation as well. We didn't use it today for the sake of clarity, but some students commented on like reading ahead on the slides and that causing them comprehension issues as well. And perhaps we need to consider this multitasking demands of the students in the classroom and support note-taking and comprehension of the slides. Okay, thank you. And this is coming out soon, perhaps by the end of this year. And if you want more information, please feel free to contact us.
Thanks very much, Aki, for walking us through the multimodal examples. As we come to the end of our portion of the talk today, the lecture portion, we recognize that there are other considerations that go into a project like this and that go into understanding someone's lecture experience. Of course, a lot of these sessions had assigned pre-lecture reading that some students did, some students didn't, so that would impact their lecture experience. There are different linguistic repertoires, different proficiency levels, and of course, different motivations for being there, different times of day, and so on. So there are other aspects, but we wanted to really focus on introducing the project and then talking about the main categories that have come up in our data, those being top-down, bottom-up, and multimodal issues. So we've called this session Some Evidence and Implications. We hope we get invited back to share some more evidence and implications. But we'll say thanks very much from us. And hopefully, Beatricia, we have time for some comments and questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. We are already very happy that you were able to share some of your results for now. The chat is open for people to type questions, and there may be already something in there. Alex will lead the Q&A in a moment, but yeah, before that, thanks very much again for an engaging session with many interesting points for discussion. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat or to raise your hand if you're able to speak. And this portion of the session will not be recorded, so we will stop the recording now.